Good morning, Year 4. Welcome to another part of our story. It's really, really cold today. I've just been outside. It's -5, my car tells me. So I've still got my scarf and my hat on, as I did. I had them on all day yesterday, and I think I'm going to be wearing them all day again today. Even inside, it's so cold. Okay, so they've arrived in a clearing, haven't they, where there was fig trees, and they've realised that there's all these orangutans lurking about. So we'll carry on from there. We'll get straight into it. I could see no real sign of aggression in them. A few of the younger adults were crashing around up in the treetops, but I felt, as with the orangutan who had shadowed us for so long through the jungle, this might just be to let us know that they were there and that they were watching, and that we had better take care not to encroach any further on their territory. I realised that any sudden movement would have been a mistake. Una clearly sensed this too. She was moving almost in slow motion as she began at last to lower herself and let me down. I followed her example and stood there stock still, looking up at them, only my eyes moving. Even so, I could see we were causing them great alarm. They were all climbing up away from us into the higher branches of the fig trees now, bunching together, mothers and infants hugging one another close. By this time, Una had clearly decided it was best to ignore them altogether and just let them get used to us. She'd begun to feast on the figs from the nearest tree. The orangutans looked on, apparently happier now, and a few of them, mostly the younger ones, were beginning to feed again, but still keeping a wary eye on us at the same time. I thought the best thing that I could do was what Una was doing. A dozen or so of these huge ripe figs were all I could manage, and all I could reach, and pick the ones that from the ground. When I'd finished, I climbed high into the branches of one of the fig trees, where I found myself a comfortable place to sit, and a perfect vantage point from which to observe the orangutans, who were now all much calmer and intent on their feeding in the trees on the far side of the clearing. The three nursing mothers had settled to their feasting like the others. They ate tidily, peeling each fig and enjoying it before looking for the next one, their babies clinging onto them easily as they clambered from one branch to another, constantly on the search for better pickings. I could see that these mothers in particular were still a little wary, still not at all sure what to make of us. Sometimes, when they had gorged themselves enough, when they were at rest in between these fig-feeding frenzies, they would sit amongst the leaves and just stare at me, trying to work me out, wondering what on earth I was. There was one moment, I remember, when it felt like all these dozens of orangutans, young and old alike, were gazing at me in awe and in wonder. For all I knew, I might have been the very first human being these creatures had ever set eyes on. One thing was for sure, though, I was as curious about them as they were about me. I couldn't help thinking that we didn't just look like one another, these orangutans and me. We were like one another. We were kindred spirits. The older orangutans, the mothers with their babies, seemed content to look on from afar. It was the young ones who made the first move. They came swinging their way slowly towards me, around the clearing, pausing every now and again to feed and to play as they came. When they moved from tree to tree, they had a curious way of doing it. They didn't swing through the trees as the gibbons did. They weren't lithe and loose-limbed like them. They didn't look like natural-born swingers. Their technique seemed slower and more considered, more cautious. They would hang there and sway themselves from side to side until they could reach out, grab the branch that they were after, and then let that branch swing them to the next tree. Every time they seemed to judge the swing just right, holding on by three hands or two hands and a foot, then reaching out with the fourth for the branch of the tree that they wanted to climb to. But it soon became worryingly clear to me that at least three of the younger adults weren't going to be content until they got a closer look at me. They were coming to check me out. Encouraged by their example, all of the other orangutans began to swing towards me through the branches. I noticed then that one of the mothers, the darkest and the largest of them, had the tiniest of infants clinging to her. She seemed to be leading a whole group of adults, most with babies hanging onto them. Everywhere I looked, they were making their way towards me through the fig trees. I found I was being approached by orangutans from all sides now. It was unnerving, but at no time as they came nearer did I feel really frightened. This wasn't an attack. I was sure of it. Well, nearly sure anyway. This was an investigation, but there were lots of them, and all their eyes were on me. I did look around to see where Una was, just for reassurance, but she had disappeared from sight. I knew roughly where she was, though. I heard her browsing in amongst the fig trees, snorting and blowing and groaning from somewhere deep in the thicket. Once or twice I could make out exactly where she was, because I could see the branches shaking. I could hear them splitting and cracking as she dragged them down and broke them off. Like me, she had clearly decided there was no threat and that she could feed here in peace and not be bothered. But it did mean that I was now left entirely alone with the orangutans. They might have looked peaceful enough, these orangutans, but all the same I was beginning to wish that Una hadn't gone off and left me. I watched them moving ever closer until they were settled all around me in amongst the branches. I found myself completely surrounded. There was only one thing for it. I kept very still, sat back in the crook of the tree, crossed my legs, folded my arms, and tried to look as relaxed as I could. Now that they were this close, I noticed that they seemed to be wanting to avoid any real eye contact. They would dart looks at me and then look away. So as I understood it, glancing was acceptable to them, but not staring. I thought it was best if I did the same too. After a while, the youngsters began to show off, each doing his best to outdare or outshine the other, or so it seemed to me, as they swung through the fig tree below me, above me, and behind me. I hardly knew which way to look. They were all around me, and so close now, far too close for comfort. One of them decided it would be fun to hang upside down and dangle there by one leg from the branch right above my head, so that as he swung, we were almost nose to nose. Another had climbed onto the branch I was sitting on and was shaking it vigorously, so that I had to hang on tight with both hands to prevent myself from falling off. In the end, to my great relief, the three mothers came and sat nearby, and they seemed to calm the youngsters down. They stopped their antics and sat there quietly eating figs and pretending to ignore me altogether. I did the same. I peeled a fig and tried to take absolutely no notice of them. It was all a game of patience. With orangutans, this was clearly how everyone got to know everyone. Just do what they do, I kept thinking, and it'll work out fine, hopefully. Una came back shortly afterwards into the clearing. I watched her as she stood there for a few moments, looking around for me. I called down to her softly so as not to upset the orangutans. She didn't seem the least bit surprised to find me sitting up there in the fig tree, surrounded by an entire family of orangutans. I threw her down the fig I had been peeling. She snuffled it up off the ground before meandering away through the trees and down towards the stream. I really hadn't been all that thirsty until I saw where she was off to. Suddenly I was longing for a drink. I was about to climb down and follow her when I saw that one of the infant orangutans had detached herself from her mother and was swinging herself slowly along the branch towards me. It was the smallest of them, and, I presumed, the youngest too. She came and sat down so close to me that I could have reached out and touched her, but I sensed that maybe this wasn't the right moment for me to move. I didn't want to do anything to scare her. I thought I would sit there, just be still and patient, and give my friend the new opportunity to introduce herself in her own time. Her mother, and this was the darkest of the mothers, the one who seemed to me like the leader, to carry most authority, was watching everything more than a little warily. As the young orangutan reached up, grasped the branch above my head, swung herself up, and dangled there beside me, one-handed. I looked into her eyes and smiled at her. I found myself laughing then. I couldn't stop myself. I was hoping it wouldn't frighten her off. What happened next took me entirely by surprise. The young orangutan reached out towards me, swung herself down onto my shoulder, then made her way along my arm and sat down beside me. She kept looking at me, then away. I didn't move. She touched my hand, tentatively at first, looking back at her mother for reassurance, it seemed. Then she grasped one of my fingers firmly and tugged at it. There was a strength and a determination in the grip of that tiny creature that I could simply not believe. I knew there was no point in trying to pull my finger away, because I knew I wasn't going to be strong enough to break free. The youngster lifted my hand to her nose, sniffed it, touching it again with her lips as she did so, before letting it fall. She looked up into my face and then touched me on the ear. I was hoping she wouldn't decide to have a grab of it and try to yank it off. Maybe it was partly to prevent that from happening that I spoke to her then. I didn't mean to. The words just came out. "That's my ear you've got," I said softly. I wanted to see how much I could make her understand. It seemed a natural thing to do. I thought I'd try something. I reached my hand out very slowly and touched the infant orangutan on her ear. "And that's your ear," I told her. "And I've got hair like you too. Not shaggy and red like yours, but it's hair all the same. And you've got 2 hands and 2 feet like me. In fact, you and me are pretty much alike. What do you think?" The orangutan was looking up at me all the time that I was speaking. There was an intelligence in her face that astonished me. This was no mere animal. I couldn't help thinking to myself that this little creature was a human in spirit as I was. It made me think then that maybe I could be every bit as animal as she was human. It was a new thought and a troubling one. The youngster made her way back to her mother after that, and for some time afterwards I sat there in my fig tree amongst the orangutans, listening to Una wallowing noisily in the river nearby. I imagined her whooshing herself down, drinking her fill, revelling in it, and I longed to climb down and join her. I was hot now, and listening to her in the river was only making me more thirsty than ever. I was longing for a drink, and for a swim too. I was sorely tempted to climb down and join her in the river, but I just couldn't bring myself to leave the orangutans. I sensed that these moments I was living through were moments to be treasured, that this close encounter might never happen again. I was so completely at one with these gentle creatures, so at ease. They wanted me to stay, I was sure of it. So I stayed. I decided I would drink later. I would swim later. With a clap of thunder so close above us that it actually shook the tree, the rains came down. The downpour was so sudden and violent that within seconds I could hardly see across to the other side of the clearing. Huddled together, hunched and bedraggled, the orangutans were sheltering as best as they could under the leaves of the fig tree. But in a gusting storm like this, even the huge fig leaves provided little protection. I noticed then that 2 of the mothers had contrived a makeshift canopy of giant leaves, holding them up above their heads, just as I had learned to do. This way both they and their babies were staying a great deal drier than the rest, and a lot drier than me too. I found I was sitting on a branch that seemed to be exposed to the worst of the storm blast, and with hardly a leaf for shelter. Like the orangutans, I just had to sit it out until the storm had ended at last, as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the forest dripping, strangely silent, and filled with mist. Only moments later I looked down to see Una come running through the trees into the clearing. I could see at once that she was unsettled by the thunder perhaps, I thought, and that surprised me because she'd never shown fear of thunder before. She was coming on a charge now, her ears were flapping, her trunk lifted and trumpeting. She was warning me of something. Not since the tidal wave had I seen her this agitated. Then I saw why. Coming out of the jungle behind her, I saw 3 men, hunters with rifles. They were taking aim, not at her and not at me, but the orangutans in the fig trees all around. A volley of shots rang out. Every bird and bat in the jungle lifted off into a cacophony of shrieking and screeching. Trumpeting her terror, Una stampeded across the clearing, vanishing into the undergrowth. I saw the dark-haired orangutan slump and slip sideways from her branch. She hung there by one hand for a brief moment. Her baby was screaming now and still clinging to her, before they came crashing down through the tree to the floor. They lay there unmoving. All the other orangutans were scattering, clambering, climbing, swinging as high as they could, as fast as they could, into the tops of the fig trees. But they weren't fast enough, and nowhere high enough. More shots rang out, and a second mother tumbled out of the tree, hitting the forest floor with a sickening thud. Stunned, until now, I had come to my senses and was screaming at the hunters to stop shooting. For just a few moments they were taken by surprise. They lowered their rifles and pointed up at me, gesticulating wildly and shouting at one another. But all too soon they began shooting again. One of the youngsters was hit in mid-swing as he tried to escape and came crashing down through the branches above me. I had no time to get out of the way. I took a glancing blow from his body as it fell, but it was enough to make me lose my balance. I tried desperately to grab a hold, tried to save myself, but I couldn't. I remembered hitting the branches as I fell through them, thinking it was taking a long time to hit the ground. Then I remembered nothing. I knew I was still alive because I could hear the sound of an engine and some music. It was several moments before I could gather my thoughts enough to realise I must be in the back of some sort of pickup truck that was being driven at speed over rough ground, rattling violently as it went, throwing me from side to side. A radio was playing the music loud, and close by the whole truck vibrating with the beat of it, and there was the sound of men laughing raucously from inside the cab. They had been the hunters I'd seen in the clearing. I could feel fingers clutching me, clawing at me. Everywhere there were warm, wet bodies clinging to me and crying. I was still trying to believe this might be the worst of nightmares, and I wanted to wake up from it. I kept trying to sit up, but I was being rocked around so much that I couldn't stay sitting for long. My head was swimming and heavy with throbbing. I could feel blood running down my face from a cut somewhere on my forehead. That was when I understood for certain that this was too real, too painful to be a nightmare. The nightmare I was hoping it might be. My vision might have been blurred, but I could see enough now to begin to make sense of my surroundings. I was in some kind of wooden cage, along with 3 little orangutans, all of them whimpering in terror, their fists gripping me tight by my hair, my t-shirt, my neck, my ear, whatever they could get hold of. My feet were tied. There was no feeling left in them. I looked up to see where I was going. I could hardly see the sky above me for smoke. Everywhere there was a stench of burning. The truck was slithering and sliding in and out of every pothole and rut it was being driven through, jolting me violently against the bars of the cage. From the cab I could hear the hunters whooping and singing. I gathered the 3 orangutans close to me, my arms around them to protect them all that I could. Now it came to me. I remembered everything. I knew well enough why they were clinging to me so tight and why they were squealing too. Every one of them had just seen their mothers killed, and I knew only too well how much that must be feeling. I hugged them to me, stroking them, talking to them, trying to console them all I could, but they were inconsolable. So many questions filled my head, all of them unanswerable. Who were these hunters? Why had we been kidnapped? What were these men going to do with us? I closed my eyes and tried to calm myself, tried to think straight. When I opened them, I found my vision was clearing itself at last, that everything was in focus again. That was when I became aware that there were eyes staring back at me from the back of the truck. Amber eyes. Tiger eyes. His paws were tied together, and they were lashed to a pole. He was lying there on a blood-soaked sack, his tongue tolling. This was the same face I remembered, the same tiger that had journeyed with us all along the trail and in my dreams. This was our tiger, but he was no longer burning bright. Okay, I'll leave that there. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the sunshine, but stay warm. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.